In the social psychology module, we're curious about how do we think about and influence and relate to one another. At the end of this module, you'll be able to describe how we interpret others' behaviors, enumerate different means of being influenced by others, and lastly, you'll get to be familiarized with some known findings about interpersonal interactions. So let's start with our first submodule. It's trying to answer the question, how do we organize our thoughts when interpreting other people's behavior? I'm going to show you some pictures first before we proceed to our discussion. In this photo, this is presented among the American and Japanese students in one study. Can you imagine what they said about the picture? Would you like to talk about it? What do you think about this picture? How would you describe this picture? So, among the American sample, most of them describe the picture as the fish are going somewhere. Whereas among the Japanese sample, they notice the different animals in the background. You have the frog, the seahorse, and the snail, and the plants. Notice the difference? So I'm going to show you another photo in a more local context sense. So this is a photo of two medically allied students, female students, who are in the jeepney standing right there just to get by in that particular moment. So we typically do this in a setting where there are no more seats available. So this is posted from Facebook page of the Top Gear Philippines. Quote, is chivalry dead? We really hope there was not a single male passenger inside that jeep. So in that statement, you will notice that there is an assumption that a male should have given up his seat for a female counterpart. So you notice that there's some violation of expectation in that particular scenario. So how do we apply those expectations in a certain scenario? In one's behavior, we try to fill in the gap and try to understand it by looking at the scenario in terms of how we understand it in our based on our past experiences. Remember the term schema? So we have one idea connected to the other idea, and this connection or relationship of one idea to another can build a context on how some objects relate to one another in a specific situation, and therefore how one person should interact with another object and how one person should interact with another person in that particular situation has some kind of a script that we follow. So in this case, what kind of script do men have to follow according to the group of people or among the Filipinos? Or is it specifically exclusive among Filipinos? Or are we referring to chivalry as some value that people impose or expect from other people? So, in trying to unravel this, let's first talk about causal attribution. So, in this example, we have a photo of a man sleeping under the tree, and it looks like it's midday. And there's some, I don't know, some fruits on his chest and around him, and he seems to be relaxed. So there are different interpretations on how we can appraise the situation in this photo. So one might say one must be lazy, or another person might say another person who has more familiarity with the context might say one must be exhausted from rising early in the morning and needs to rest while there is scorching heat of the sun. So these two differences of attributing behavior are called the dispositional and situational. When we call it dispositional when the attributions of the behavior is referring to the internal characteristics of the person that is stable, like their traits or their preferences. In the situational attribution, we're trying to explain someone's behavior according to the specific circumstance that they are in at a particular moment. So this is causal attribution. Causal attribution, that's an inference about what caused a person's behavior. So now you might be wondering what could be the determinant as to why people would tend to use this positional attribution of behavior, or another might use more situational attribution of behavior. Remember this photo? This is relevant in our discussion. Culture can influence our causal attribution in explaining people's behavior. The most famous research in social psychology is referring to this particular domain called the individualistic versus collectivistic cultures, or our independent or interdependent self construal about the situation. So, in the individualistic culture, mostly the Western population, and the collectivistic culture, mostly are the Eastern population or the Asians or the global South. So they tend to have different set of values that come to play when we are trying to understand or explain people's behavior. In the individualistic culture, they tend to focus on their independence, their self reliance, they're achievement oriented, competitive, they value assertiveness, and they endorse pleasure seeking. They tend to be self assured, they're direct when they communicate, and they value their self interest or endorse their self interest in a situation. This is because they tend to view themselves and others as independent. And because of that, they have this motivation for standing out by achieving their personal goals. So if there is a competition of goals between one's achievement versus sacrificing oneself for others, for the individualistic culture, it's more ideal, or by default, more inclined to tend to pursue self achievement or pursuing independence or personal goals. In contrast, in the collectivistic culture, people who are members of collectivistic cultures tend to view themselves and the others as interdependent, and so therefore they're motivated to behave according to the situational demands and expectation of other people. They are more sensitive to how other people might think about them, and therefore may modify their behavior in order to accommodate other people's comfort. In this case, there's a value of harmonious relationship in a group. There's also more emphasis on the value of being obedient among the authorities, and there's more value of being self-controlled or self-disciplined in order to follow the authority, and therefore being part of a group, it is expected that one must cooperate in order to fulfill the goals aspirations. There's also a sense of equalitarian as opposed to the self-interest in the individualistic culture. Okay, so now do you remember the photo that we showed earlier? So this picture is one among the studies that compared how the individualistic culture represented by the American students and the collectivistic culture as represented by the Japanese sample is being different on the way they perceive a particular scenario. So in this picture, there are various things that are in it, but how they interpret it might be systematically different in terms of how some agents in the photo, such as the fish is that seem to be occupying a lot of space in the photo relatively among the others. You might focus on it as some agentic character in a story. And In the background, since the Japanese students, the sample are more sensitive to what's in the environment of the fish, they tend to focus more on the other objects around the photo, such as the other animals along with the fish and the plants along with it. So, moving forward, given this knowledge about the individualistic and collectivistic culture, now you can be confident to infer, you're now more inclined to think that if you follow the individualistic perspective, you might be referring to dispositional attribution of behavior more than if you follow or subscribe to collectivistic culture more often, then you have a tendency to try to understand the situation according to its contextual factors. So the famous term or notion about the attribution on its asymmetry is the fundamental attribution error. So this is our tendency to overestimate the role of the person in the situation and overlook the context as to how it played like that. So for instance, if we are looking at Juan right here, we have a tendency to overlook at the weather or the climate or the typical routine of a farmer, and instead we might be more inclined to think that he must be lazy because he is sleeping in a meeting. So in contrast, when we think about our own behavior, when we interpret our own behavior, we are more sensitive to our context or to our situation more. We are more attuned to our situation in trying to explain our behavior as opposed to when we're explaining other people's behavior. So there's this kind of asymmetry when we look at ourselves and when we look at others. In another study where they conducted an experiment where they primed, remember in our past module, the thinking module, the method of priming. Okay. So they primed their participants in a between subjects design experiment. Some of them were randomly assigned to writing 10 sentences about American culture. Some were randomly assigned to write 10 sentences about Chinese culture. And in the control group, they were randomly assigned to write 10 sentences about landscapes. So after this, they were presented with a scenario about an overweight boy who was advised by a physician not to eat food with high sugar. And then one day, he and his friends went to a buffet dinner where a delicious looking cake was offered. So, despite this high sugar content, the overweight boy ate it. After reading the story, the participants were asked to indicate to the extent to which the boy's weight problem was caused by his personality or by the situation. So, as the hypothesis might indicate, they found that those who are randomly assigned to write sentences about American culture or who are primed to the individualistic culture are observed to write or explain his behavior according to his attributes. Whereas in the collectivistic culture, they use the situational attribution more in accounting for the overweight boy's behavior at that particular situation.